Ladies and gentlemen, it is something highly special to be welcoming you here today in this room, and that you've all turned out so numerously to the Academy of Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. Very warm welcome to the 13th Adenauer Conference entitled A World Marked by Uncertainty, the Hour of Europe. I am delighted to be welcoming all of you today, including so many representatives of the media, and I'm particularly pleased to welcome those that are going to give speeches today and that are going to join our discussions. And first and foremost, we are going to have our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Johann Wadephul, who has always been a very loyal guest to Konrad-Adenauer Foundation. Very nice to have you here, dear Joe. And of course, it is a particular pleasure to me to welcome my two predecessors, Hans-Gerd Pöttering, in charge of Europe, and Norbert Lammert, our honorary president. A very warm welcome to you as well. So nice having you. During the panel discussion, we are going to have a discussion with Tanja Gönner, Dr. Jana Puljarin, and Roland Theis. Let me welcome you most cordially as well. And instructive discussions need to be moderated, so I'm all the more delighted that Dr. Sauerbrei from the Zeit and Dr. Christina Krause, in charge of international policy and security from the Foundation, have taken on this task. Thank you so much. Ladies, gentlemen, if we had talked about our topic at hand today, if we had done so 5, 10, or 15 years ago, I wouldn't have expected such a huge turnout and such a big interest on the part of the media, because of course these have always been very intriguing, basic, fundamental debates. But to be honest, in the past they used to be somewhat theoretical debates and speeches on European security policy. They were interesting for the security policy community, but they were maybe somewhat off the radar of the wider public. And today we come to realize that you've all traveled here, reaching far beyond this interested community, and that we've been joined by so many media representatives. And this goes to show that we live in an era which is no longer just about theoretical reflections or questions in this discussion, but it is all about matters that have practical relevance, quite immediately so. And we're very much driven around by this in Germany, traditionally speaking, because we experienced the division towards the outside and towards the inside. But all of these factors are interdependent. This is something we experience at present when we look at the war in Iran, which was not our war, of course, if we want to formulate it like that. But the question is, who began it and why? And when it comes to economic, security policy, military consequences, and when it comes to international principles like freedom of navigation and maritime waterways. It is our war because it affects us directly and it poses a challenge to us with all of its consequences. And when it comes to the question of what we can derive from it, what can be the conclusions we draw from it and what we can suggest. And when looking at freedom of navigation, mentioning this, the conflicts we're faced with at present demonstrate that in terms of foreign and security policy, we are facing a predicament that we've maybe always had between our own values, the role of international law, the role of international principles on the one hand, and pragmatic policy making on the other hand, that we're very much challenged by. And we are facing this dilemma, maybe even more so than in the past. And it is our mission at the Konrad-Adenauer Foundation to see to it that we can have discussions, events, and analyses to make sure that we're not hiding these values and principles, but it is all about demonstrating that we are living in an era where there are more nuances and grey zones than we used to have in the past. And it is a mission of responsible policy making to navigate these grey areas, to be talking about them and to be finding approval. And I do know, Minister of Foreign Affairs, that this is one of the major challenges that you're faced with time and again in your daily business. This Adenauer Conference of 2026 takes place in a very special year, in the year in which we are celebrating the 150th anniversary of Konrad Adenauer, who lent his name to this foundation. And we are not only celebrating the memory of his person, but we are benefiting from this year in order to recall the basic principles that he set out and that we still orient ourselves by, that are still the foundations of our policies, and to discuss also about what this can translate into for today's world. Two basic pillars are the transatlantic partnership, for one, and Europe on the other hand. The transatlantic partnership at the moment is in dire straits. Everyone must have realized it, but I do believe, and this is something where we can feel committed as Adenauer Foundation, it is a partnership that should never be negligently abandoned, and in particular not today. And all of these decisions reflect the big crises of these times. The foreign minister will recall that we've been discussing about troop withdrawals of the Americans on other occasions, and when it comes to stationing missiles, that this has got to do with the fact that stockpiles in the United States, weapon stockpiles, are maybe not that well filled in the United States either. This is also something that needs to be mentioned. And maybe a quote by Konrad-Adenauer of 1961 may help, when he said the United States are the natural leadership power of this alliance as the strongest country, and you refer to NATO, but leadership amongst the free does not boil to the strongest imposing its will on the partners, but it boils down to realizing and making others know about one's intentions. So you realize that the communication between the United States and Europeans has always been of interest to us, and not only since we've had Donald Trump as a president. And this is something quite reassuring, because obviously this is a task that we've always had to shoulder, and even in the past, and this inspires us with optimism for the times we live in. And let me continue with another quote by Adenauer on Europe. It dates back to 1950, when he said, "What does Europe live on? It lives by the grace of the United States. That will not always stay that way. One day the moment will come, and must come, when this Europe can help itself again and must stand on its own feet." And when thinking back to these times to 1950, then this quotation, of course, is more than justified, because at the time we largely were dependent in economic terms and in reconstruction terms. We were dependent on the commitment of the United States. But we can be self-confident now, saying that this call made by Konrad-Adenauer is one we've become owners of, because so many things have been going on since then, because Europe has become one of the most important market powers of this world, an important trading partner. And it is also most compelling that Europe becomes now attractive again in times of tariffs. And we've created a freedom of trade, a common currency, freedom of movement for goods and persons. And we've managed to achieve a lot with joint research programs, and this is why we can bank on this power, on this force, and rely on it. And it is true that in particular in the field of security policy, particularly in terms of our military capabilities, we are still somewhat dependent on the United States, for sure. And it's always been in our interest to reduce this dependency. And we are aware of the fact that when asking Europe's citizens, there is hardly any topic that finds so much approval for joint action as is the topic of joint defense policy, joint procurement. And we're also aware that there is hardly any topic that is so hard to translate nationally as this one is. So, Minister, we very much look forward to your speech on Europe. The Adenauer Conference is held a couple of days before the 9th of May. And in this context, we can think of another remarkable personality and the founding father of Europe, Robert Schuman, who said that the big missions require big ambitions to solve them. And on the other hand, in his declaration, he pointed out that Europe wouldn't come true overnight, but Europe would have to be worked on time and again, continuously, visions and agency, looking ahead and pragmatism. This is what Europe needs, and we are quite sure that you're going to set the right impulses, the right impetus for it. Thank you so much.
Dear President, ladies and gentlemen, dear Honorary Excellencies, dear colleagues from the German Bundestag, dear colleague from Japanese, Ito-chan, konnichiwa. It is a huge honor to welcome you here, together with your Japanese delegation. As an absolute huge fan of Japan, I feel particularly honored by your presence. Coal and steel, two raw materials for industrial production, who for centuries had been both the driving force and the triggering moments, built in 1950 one of the most successful peace projects. Annegret, you mentioned it, now it's the 9th of May. In 1950, with the Schuman Declaration, a European stone was brought into rolling just a year later, about 75 years ago. Konrad-Adenauer, Robert Schuman, and Hotzer, and the three Benelux colleagues signed the treaty that marked the beginning of the European Community of Steel and Coal. Konrad-Adenauer released immediately the historic opportunity for the young Federal Republic, an opportunity for a lasting tie to the West, and at eyes level, would it be possible for Germany to act in Europe? This new community made Germany big and capable of action, but the time in which coal and steel are the backbone of Europe's economy are over. 75 years later, its materials like dysprosium, samarium, and silicon, these are the key raw materials, rare earths. These are the prerequisites for our industrial basis, but they are not to be found in European countries. 97% of the needs for rare and heavy earths are bought in from China by Europe from 6% to 30%. China increased its share of the world trade. The European Union share shrunk from 19 to 15, 2025. In Germany, we have more than 300 industrial workplaces every day. This Chinese trade and industrial policy distorts global markets massively. This will be reinforced by the new 5-year plan of China, where it tries to cement its global leadership role. Not enough. At the same time, European exports to other markets are plummeting, especially towards the US. With the developments in AI and digital economy, we still cannot keep up with. European digital markets are too small and fragmented to promote innovative technologies to this necessary degree. In parallel, we are faced with a serious crisis of security policy because we are faced with 2 wars. Ukraine is standing firm in the 5th year against the Russian war of aggression. We support Ukraine in the fight for defense with considerable resources because Ukraine defends also our European freedom. And the Gulf War challenges us as well, economically, politically, and probably also militarily in the future. This war affects directly our European interests. You mentioned it a while ago. It is the expression of a new world order in transformation. Take to this also the transatlantic relationship. The US speak much clearer and much more poignantly the priority of their interests. At the same time, they consider the transatlantic alliance as something that is beneficial to them and has to benefit them. We can and we must accept this change and must shape it. The potential is enormous. The prerequisites are clear. It lies all in European unity and unison. Only the common weight that the European Union can bring in will make us able to act. Effective answers can be given only in such a way. We do have the resources that are necessary. We must use them. The internal market is one of the 3 biggest internal markets of the world. It may lend us the weight and the power to compete at eyes level with the American and the Chinese economies. But we must make full use of it. By example, startups that are established in Germany and Lithuania must be able to work also in Estonia or in Italy. They must get financial funding in Europe. They need them to conquer the world market because brilliant ideas are popping up everywhere. But all too often they migrate away from Europe. The Commission is driving forward a very ambitious agenda for the internal market that will reinforce it. The project of an internal market for defense goods could also increase the cooperation in planning, development, and procurement in Europe. It may also accelerate this existential necessity of accelerating the purchasing and designing process. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, in her office as the Minister of Defense, felt it on on her own screen. Think of the omnibus package, the 90 billion loans to Ukraine, the SAFE initiative, security action for Europe on investments in joint procurement, and the European Defence Industry Programme, with which critical military capacities shall be reconquered. All of that would hardly have been imaginable a few years ago. But with technological dominance, the European dominance has lagged sufficiently behind the US. Here, the European Union will do something thanks to the competitiveness agenda and through to our potential of innovation and investment. In short, European patents must be morphed into European companies. It is about strengthening the EU as a geo-economic actor. We are doing so as a reliable trade partner based on the rule-based international order. And it pays off. The Mercosur agreement with South American interests in force since 1st of May. The agreement with India is equally important. India is negotiating the market opening. No other actor could reach this with Mexico. The signing is on the agenda just in a few weeks. These successes are based also on the fact that our trading partners, as we ourselves, depend on certain supply chains, and we want to shape our supply chains more resiliently. We want to benefit from these opportunities to open up new markets. Ladies and gentlemen, we are looking at the Strait of Hormuz these days, and what we are seeing even in other places, how important diversification is. Yes, we are reliable, we are steadfast in EU, but we must become more agile, more flexible, more innovative. Therefore, the European Union must adapt to reality. It must change in a fundamental sense. As Adenauer and Schuman responded to the need for a new world order, and they found it with conviction and courage. And we should follow up on this courage, because we Europeans are masters of our destiny. Let me address 6 concrete points in very concrete detail. First, in Brussels, we want to talk more, we want to achieve more through reinforced cooperation in policy areas where joint progress can probably not be reached with all 27 members. We want to bring this forward with a smaller group of countries. The necessary measures shall be implemented in a European scale without everybody being forced to join. Time and time again, it has shown that the other countries will follow suit. We want to strengthen this. We want to expand this to the common security and foreign policy. As in the past, unanimous decision-making is still requested. My proposal would mean states that do not want, or countries that cannot follow suit, will remain outside, but they will not impede those that take the lead. A group of countries should also be able to move forward with less impediments. Still, we will always try to reach a consensus amongst all 27 countries, because this is the virtue and strength of the European Union. But what matters is that we take a pragmatic approach, even if not all 27 member states can give a 100% agreement. The blockades, especially the blockades of the last months and years, by which the European Union was taken hostage by national and third-party concerns, are well known to you. Up until the recent week, we could see the release of financial funds could make this clear. The dissensus of just a few members is enough to block the action of all others. In terms of security, this principle of unanimity may put our lives at risk. It's about life and death. We see it day in, day out in Ukraine. In the joint foreign and security policy, The EU seems to be hostage to an obsolete architecture. Conservatives and also people that are considered to be also conservatives, well, we must keep a strong hold on proven old things. No, this is not true in foreign policy. Conservative foreign policy is oriented towards the interests of a country. It changes what needs to be changed to protect the civil achievements. Which brings me to the second point. The qualified vote by majority. Germany wants to move things in the European Union, but Brussels must accelerate its pace, especially in the joint foreign and security policy. The most important lever is a faster decision-making by a qualified majority. This looking for consensus will not be abandoned, but by abolishing blockade options, we will make it easier. Our objective will be the greatest possible unity of all 27 members, but the path to it, not through the smallest common denominator. It leads through the courage to take the first step. The keyword, as the High Representative called the qualified majority, has got the potential to make the European Union able to act where right now it needs to persist in a standstill. This wish for change is not our own alone. 12 other member states have shared us in this wish for this change. And of course, we will address all member states, even those that are as yet skeptical. Let me state it plainly and clearly. It is up to our decision makers in the European Union to use this tool of a quick decision making. The juridical framework is there in the defense area. With this permanent PESCO scheme, we could show that it is workable. A group of EU members established a tool of joint action. By the way, we need to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of this principle of unanimity? Well, it was once introduced to safeguard the sovereignty of the national states in the most sensible area or sensitive area, security and foreign policy. But what remains of national sovereignty if the execution of national sovereignty can be blocked by one single state? We need to change our mindset. Whenever I'm not in agreement with one proposal, well, in a community of 27, the answer cannot be, well, I'm going to block it. Instead, the best possible solution must be found. Third point, a clear profile in foreign policy for the European Union. We need a quick ability to respond with concrete results for Europe. At present, the President of the European Commission, the President of the European Council, the High Representative, and the high number of commissioners take great merit. At the same time, the competence for foreign and security policies must be bundled and clearly marked. The foreign service of the European Union must be intertwined with the European Commission, because these are the resources where all the major fields of policy can be managed. Interconnected security needs interconnected action. Well, we in the European Union needs to safeguard our position in a much stronger force than 10, 15 or 20 years ago. Would anybody believe this? It must be our objective to shape our European action more coherent, more efficient. The European Union is not a static construction. Let's take a look at the way that we have been going through the last years, through the strategic compass as a common analysis of threats, down to the concrete coordination of very comprehensive arms supplies to Ukraine and the financing of defense initiatives in the member states. Many things have changed substantially. Well, the European Union has given proof of its ability to reform. All this was a sheer necessity. Fourth point, rule of law. With all the developments, we must also reflect carefully. Reflect on the major values of our union, because the rule of law is one of the highest values that we cherish in Europe. It is the hallmark of our perspective to the world. It also shapes the image that the world has of us. We want to reinforce the rule of law in the context of the multi-annual financial, but also in the EU 7 fund. We want to further develop a conditionality mechanism. EU funds must not go to those who violate our common values. Ladies and gentlemen, the ability to act means, and this is the fifth point, institutions must be functional and fully effective, even if the union grows, and it needs to grow. But any union with 33, 34, or 35 members cannot go down the same lines with the same approach that was initially designed for a much smaller group of countries. Do we want to have 35 commissioners? Well, I would strongly regard this. So we want a smaller commission that comprises only 2/3 of the number of member states. Similarly, the European Parliament should go through a reduction. We see even in nations, the challenges that come along with an excessively big parliament. Therefore, we want to reduce the number of parliamentarians, and we want to adjust this to an enlarged union. We need decisions in the European Council, and we need to address this topic. Yes, we do want an enlarged European Union, but it must still be working fully. And I understand the huge frustration with the long, winding negotiations for accession. But first, we do want new members that we want to integrate. Second, we need a sustainable change in the mechanism of access. This is a transformative process. And my sixth and last point, the process of enlargement. I suggest the path to the accession of new members should be a phased approach. First, a gradual integration through pre-phases to the full accession. Through such a mechanism, it will be possible to settle certain reservations and doubts about the membership of certain candidates in the past. In the accession agreements, we could also have some clauses on the conditioning of the accession, thus strengthening the principle of loyal cooperation. But let me state it clearly. Expansion is part of our credibility. The human beings, especially in the Western Balkans, were promised decades ago the perspective to join Europe, and we owe them results. So, to that end, we need to achieve concrete progress with the accession countries. The accession of Iceland and Norway is more than welcome. It goes without saying. With 6 proposals, I'm going to make our EU more resilient and more capable of action. In the Schuman Declaration, it states peace in the world cannot be preserved without creative efforts that correspond to the size of the threat. In view of the crisis of our time that have an existential character, the existential threats that we are faced with, our creative effort must lie in a strengthened cooperation in Europe. We must all fully realize the future of our nation. And we do so also in Brussels, because Europe has the key for a future of Germany in security, with wealth, and in freedom. For 75 years, where would we stand without the courage of its founding fathers? So let us take this as a stimulus and also an obligation. Thank you very much.
Ja, Herr Minister.
Minister, thank you so much for this highly interesting speech. And we'll have some 20 minutes for questions and answers, and I'll turn to the audience, telling you that you'll have the floor as well, and we're going to accept 2 or 3 questions on your behalf towards the end. Let me pick up on your speech with a couple of questions. There was a lot in it, and I'm not going to go through the 6 points, but you underlined the principle of unanimity so much. How would you want to change this? Are you thinking of coalitions that would do it, or would you want to modify treaties? Well, to be upfront, and I don't want to beat about the bush, I would rather not narrow this down to an amendment of treaties discussion, because otherwise we're going to talk about modifying treaties only. Are you in favor of it? Are you against it? How can we reach it to attain unanimity? But let's get down to content, to the specifics of what we are going to do, how we're going to go about things in terms of better cooperation or by practicing qualified majorities. And then let's look at the different content matters at hand and how we can solve them and with which instruments we can solve them. Of course, everyone will aspire to do as much as possible, as effectively as possible, without changing the treaties. And possibly everything can be solved in a consensus way of achieving things without amending the treaties. But I cannot rule out that we would come to a point where we'd have to look into the treaties once again. But I mean, when talking about amending treaties from the start, then I'm afraid, and this reminds me of discussions of the past, that this discussion will be narrowed down to this, so of course, important but categoric formal matter without reaching specific results for our work. So let me put it that way. Let's talk about acting pragmatically, practicing things to get to questions of procedures and changing possibly the legal foundations that we need to react to. But this should not be our topmost priority, because there's so many acute questions that we need to find answers to. The world is not waiting for Europe to sort out its own internal matters. The world is turning, the world is changing, and the world is looking for the formats that are necessary. So there is no such thing as a vacuum or a void of political, economic, or military influence. But this void is always going to be filled by someone else. So if we're not filling it, and it has to be in our own interest in Europe to be able to find a consensus. So let's roll up our sleeves. Courage is of the essence, and we need energy, and we should not just sit back on our laurels and tell ourselves, well, the elections in Hungary turned out well, probably for Europe, and so we can wait and do nothing. But we should have the opposite reflex and get down to action. So you mentioned that Europe needs a foreign policy face. I'm paraphrasing the same old questions. Whom do the Americans call in Brussels when they want to talk to someone? And if I understood you correctly, you think that the representative of foreign policy should be strengthened. So this would mean that Ms. Callas would travel to China, to Washington, would represent the European Union, and the Commission's president and the member states would step down somewhat. Well, of course, she is my first sparring partner in Europe, if you will. And she is a prima inter pares, if you will, whenever we gather as European ministers of foreign affairs. And for sure, she is the first port of call that I'm thinking of that would come to my mind. But please give some thought to something we need to discuss, that indeed, when we wish Europe, and if we wish Europe to become relevant, if we wish the EU to become relevant, we need to define an institution that has a face, which is presiding over matters. It's got a hat on, if you will, and ladies can wear a hat as brilliantly as men can do, of course. So we have to be very open-minded here. And what I'm experiencing, and I just mentioned the United States and China, that the two of them do not have as a first impulse to turn to the European Union and its representatives. Well, there's one male representative, Mr. Costa. They don't have the reflex to gather them round the table straight on Trump and send Ms. Callas, possibly. Well, as you know, Germany is always thinking in European terms and is always ready to renounce to its own interests for the sake of Europe, but I'm not going to comment on this metaphor. So would Germany be able to renounce to one of the many commissioners? Well, I mentioned the metaphor when I talked to another person, Tilman Kuban, just before. I'm pointing at you. Well, I cannot point to Tilman Kuban without forgetting that three fingers point back at me. So Germany, of course, is never going to be able to say, let's bring down the number of commissioners, but Germany must be exempted from it. This can never be my position, and this was never my proposal. On a day like this, Mr. Kuban wants to become a commissioner. That's what he said. Well, of course, this topic is off the table for Mr. Kuban, now that he said it. Well, these days we can't really circumvent talking about current matters. A couple of days after the announcement made by Donald Trump to withdraw soldiers from Germany, and he no longer wants to station medium-range missiles in Germany, would you stick to the sentence that you mentioned in an interview with the FAZ newspaper when you said that the transatlantic alliance was steadfast? And I missed that phrase in your speech. Well, of course, this one was not a transatlantic speech, but it was a European speech when I explicitly intended to tell you something about the future of the European Union. And as soldiers say, well, full stop, new topic, the transatlantic alliance is steadfast, and I'm not telling you this because I have to as a German foreign minister, but because it's my own personal conviction. And by the way, let's pick up on what our chairwoman just said, our president just said. It would not change in the wake of those decisions or announcements that are being made right now, and this spirit would not change even if these decisions were implemented. And we are in close contact with the American administration, and as it's about stationing military, this is in the hands of the defense ministry. But let's be very honest about it. Let me underscore what Annegret said. Ladies and gentlemen, these United States of America freed us from Nazi terror. And they made sacrifices, considerable sacrifices to do so. They reconstructed Germany democratically and economically, and they supported the reunification of our home country. There was a lot of skepticism in Europe, and the United States trusted us. And all the things that are now irritating us won't actually distract me from trusting this country, its culture, its people, and its institutions. And this is going to stay that way. And I experience this every day in my cooperation with Marco Rubio, whom I appreciate a lot and with whom I have brilliant talks. And when looking at the war in Iran, there's a big match of interests towards this regime. But the way I'm experiencing the United States of America with its decision makers is that they are very responsible, very much interested in Europe, and I see them as highly cooperative and pro-transatlantic relations. And this also can be seen in voices uttered from amongst Senate members. And we should not put into question things that nobody would want to have, and nobody would have questioned in Washington either, not even the American president. This is the way I look at things, and this wouldn't mean that we'd just be in the role of a bystander, of a helpless victim, just enduring something. And Adenauer was quoted in saying that leadership has to be carried out in a partnership, in a democracy, and this requires that the most influential partner would have to live by a partnership spirit, and everyone can contribute to this partnership. And this is the way I see talks with Marco Rubio and the different conferences and contacts we have in professional terms. And let's keep up the good work this way. And if we see NATO, which has been strengthened by the contributions of Sweden and Finland, and which has become ever stronger. If we nurture these bonds, then they're going to have a brilliant future. And of course, the transatlantic bonds go far beyond that: economic relations, cultural relations, what have you. Of course, there are always ups and downs in this relationship, and our role in Europe and in this transatlantic relationship is a role of pondering, of checks and balances, of moderating, and of understanding and building bridges. I mean, of course, these things are all interlinked. European development is dependent on our relationship towards the United States. But please excuse me for interrupting you. This is why I explicitly said that Europe has to have greater agency, has to grow up, has to be able to take its own decisions, and more so than in the past. And of course, this is also a consequence of reshaping, of having to redefine the transatlantic relationship, not categorically, but somewhat. It's also a consequence of the changing behavior displayed by China as opposed to what happened 15 years ago. The American president weakened the transatlantic alliance in 2 points massively in the past couple of days. He's weakening his partners economically by imposing tariffs, amongst others, on cars, you mentioned it, and he's weakening Germany and NATO by leaving a capability gap that he could have closed for the time being. I mean, how steadfast is this alliance? How robust is it? Well, first and foremost, this president strengthened the alliance substantially in the first place by making a very clear call at the last NATO summit in The Hague. This was implemented, by the way, of spending 5% on defense, 3.5% for core defense matters, and 1.5% for defense infrastructure. And you cannot deny that without his call, this wouldn't have come about, possibly. And I attended the foreign ministers' summit, and I commented on it as one of the first persons, and we said that this was the right thing to do, and now that he's launching a call on us, we should all play along. And this is why we held this successful summit in The Hague, and many others followed suit, and we made a joint decision. And in the first place, this made us stronger. But whether there will be a capability gap further down the road in the field of long-range weapon systems in Germany and in Europe is not yet clear. And I'm quoting my colleague Boris Pistorius, the defense minister, who said that there are so many other imaginable solutions we are giving thought to. And once we have a result, we're going to let you know about it. But of course, in this field, we're going to need a solution. We need to be able to deter when faced with Russia. This is quite plain to see, because we've come to realize, and this is a bitter pill we had to swallow, that in Europe, Russia is our adversary. So we will need respective defense systems to counteract this. And I'm fully convinced that we're going to have them. So the American decision is not yet taken. Well, I'm not looking into internal matters of the American administration. What does Marco Rubio tell you? Well, this is a question for defense ministers or for the Minister of War, when referring to the American colleague, to sort out. And as far as this is concerned, we are having talks, and we are pursuing a staunch intention to provide these capabilities for the future, and I am positive that we're going to be able to succeed in that way. You also mentioned the war in Iran. Of course, an ad hoc coalition is emerging the way you wanted for Europe, talks about how Europeans could help to free the Strait of Hormuz. German minesweeper vessel is on its way towards the Mediterranean. Do you think that this will help the transatlantic relationship when Europe becomes more active here? Well, of course, absolutely, because this is what the Americans asked us to do for a scenario after ending the hostilities, to ensure that the Strait of Hormuz could be navigated through freely without any risks posed by mines. And this is why we are getting prepared to such a scenario. And the Minister of Defense decided to dispatch and to deploy a minesweeper vessel to the Mediterranean. And so we are prepared for such a situations. And the Americans are taking note of that. Whether this scenario will come into play, we don't know. The first prerequisite will be a basic agreement between the US and Iran, which we don't have as yet. And I can only reiterate most clearly and call upon Iran to launch negotiations about it and to show readiness to make concessions and conclude an agreement that will ensure that Iran will not own the nuclear weapon. And of course, this is a position we share with the United States of America. And by the way, Gideon Stars is a colleague. And so we share this interest with Israel, by the way. So we have a common security interest as Europeans, Americans, and Israelis, and also most of the neighboring states have that interest in common towards Iran. Iran's behavior is not only against international law, but it really made for uncertainty. And please imagine that Iran were equipped with a nuclear weapon. It would be an utter risk posed to world peace, and the global community has to really prevent this from happening. And we've got a very unified position on that.
You just had a phone call with Arakchi, the Iranian foreign minister. How close are you to definitive talks? Well, we are at least in talks in also very substantial decades for decades. For 1 decade, he said, for the first time, there is a real opportunity to find a solution, and one has never been as close as now. If this is his assessment, I take it as he states it. Probably he is faced with certain difficulties to impose this on the entire government, but probably not everybody has seen the gravity of the situation. This does not mean that we support this, that we want a free Strait of Hormuz. Well, there is not the least legitimization for Iran to block the entire strait, and in 30 days afterwards, we would once again discuss the nuclear issue. No, the nuclear issue must be settled now. The details, where it will be enriched and how, to what degree it can be enriched, and what, well, that remains to be seen. But this Iran's commitment to make a contribution, to install the certainty that there will never be a nuclear weapon in that region, well, this needs to be pushed through, and the hard position of the US is the right one. We would briefly open up the debate. Please give us quick and very crisp questions. Who wants to ask a question? There is a handheld microphone. Yes, who have been the first one in the last row to the corridor? I come from the non-European country by the name of Canada. Canada's geopolitical and geo-economic sovereignty depends largely on the relationship with Europe. It's the only country participating in SAFE. How do you see a future relationship with Canada and Canada's contribution that might be brought in for a better independence and agency of Europe? And how can Canada's independence and agency better safeguarded in the view of the ever closer growing together interests of Germany, Europe, and Canada. There are excellent bilateral relationships between our two countries. Anita Anand, my colleague, visited my ministry, and I'm going to travel there. Many ministers, the Federal Chancellor, Prime Minister Carney has made a joint visit to Norway with Norway's Prime Minister Støre. We are G7 partners, we are NATO partners, and also the topic that you mentioned, rare earths, raw materials, commodities. Well, this is a field where we cooperate very closely. So there is a huge potential. Together with Norway, we offered a very interesting offer to buy a submarine to Norway. You can probably take it home, that there will be taken a second look at our quote and probably even accepts it. Anyway, all this will be settled in a professional and friendly manner. So the potential is indeed huge. I believe the bridge is always growing because in Iceland there is a serious discussion about an accession to the European Union. If you think further down the road, Greenland, which belongs to the Kingdom of Denmark, full stop, then we are anyway closely linked. And I believe that there is a huge congruity of interest at almost 100%, and the unison of values between Canada and the European Union is 100%. So I think we have a very, very good, very reliable, and I must say from a European perspective, a direly needed partner by our side. The lady in the white blazer. Hello, Mr. Wadephul. Moin. Please, Richard Füssen from Politico. Two questions on the EU expansion. Does it mean before the setting in of reforms, before the introduction of the abolition of the principle of unanimity, there will be no accession, or would it be independent from each other? How confident are you that you will reach this abolition of unanimity? Because to abolish it, you need unanimity. It is not to be taken for granted that now that Orban is out, this question can be settled. I would not link the two things together. When it comes to the unanimity, I think we need to reach a solution as quickly as possible. I told you reinforced cooperation is a thing of dire necessity. Those who do not want to join us or who cannot follow along this line, may they please support it in a constructive way. They may say, okay, let us others do it and go ahead, and then we will see whether we want to be integrated, and so on and so on. We need flexibility, but let me state it once again. The entire situation is urgent. We cannot wait for a longer time. We cannot say, well, in all likelihood, by the end of 2027, there is the first inkling of an opportunity that we will have a chance to bring in the next country. We haven't got these 2 years, ladies and gentlemen. We need to take a higher pace. The world is not waiting. The world is waiting for responses, and it takes absolute agency. Once again, if we cannot achieve this as European Union, others will achieve it, and we do not want this to happen. Germany wants the EU to take the lead, to become the trailblazer, but the EU must step forward. It's not the EU, it's 27 member states, but also so many decision makers in Brussels. But I've got to say it once again, what else do you want to happen around the globe before we Europeans realize that this is the hour where the courage of those founding fathers is needed? I try to imagine this. I find it difficult. And I think everybody here in Rome will share this view. What was the situation at the beginning of the 50s? 1950, 1951, 5 years, 6 years after the end of this terrible World War II, where everything was lying in rubbles, and morally speaking, there was so much coping with and repentance needed. Nonetheless, it was possible. The hands were stretched out. There was a sense of unison and a community. This was a much more difficult starting point than what we've got today. We must not comfort us with a false certainty because everything seems to work. Still, I told you at the beginning, we are losing ground day in, day out. We are losing the catching up race. I mentioned the number of industrial jobs that we lose every individual day. So what is needed is a qualitative leap forward. We must not lose any time. Sorry, at this point we need to bring this to a close because the protocol will otherwise storm the rostrum and will push us aside. Thank you very much, Mr. Wadephul, our Foreign Minister. I will hand over to Dr. Christina Krause, and they will shed some further light on in depth on these issues. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please stay with us. What waits for us is a panel, we say, under the title of Steadfast and Ready to Act. We've got the vision, we've got the objective, but how can we get there? Do we really know that we share this common objective and that we want to knuckle down together in the 27 EU member states, in the 32 member states with a population of 84 million here in Germany? I'm very much looking forward to panel. And I welcome Tanja Göner. She is the general manager of the BDI, the Federal Association of German Industry. Please have a seat. Roland Theis, member of the German Bundestag, member also in the EU Commission and in the Defense Committee. Please take the place at the center. Dr. Jana Puljarin from ECFR. You know certainly her book, Who Defends Europe? I think this is a very apt title in this setting. My name is Christina Krause. I am responsible for the team International Politics and Security. Ms. Göner, before we delve into the depths, well, the Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs told us we are losing ground every day. Hardly anybody else sees it at such close quarters as you. What is the most important aspect from the speech of the foreign minister? Why should one start with easy questions when there are difficult ones also available? Well, I think it's the key question for us in Germany. When we look around all those changes in the geopolitical landscape, and if we reflect on what makes the strength of Germany as a middle power, but also inside Europe and as a European power, well, then on the one hand, it's just size, the number of citizens living in this country, and second, it's also due to the economic strength of this country. If we see anything in the geopolitical and geoeconomic scenery, it is obvious that we need to ask who is strongest in political or in economic terms and how can it succeed. We need to say that this huge task given to us, we must make Germany an industrial site attractive. This would be 1/4 of the GDP of Europe. Well, other countries would be happy to see a flourishing and wealthy Germany. And this lends also a certain vigor and force to Europe. And second, if I may say so, I have not jotted down everything, but what do we need in Europe? And he mentioned the principle of unanimity. It's about structural reforms in the very structure of Europe. I would say in Germany, modernization of the government in line with debureaucratization. That would be a thing that takes nothing else but a lot of political force. Yes, it costs a lot of political force, but no money at all. It would make a contribution to zooming in closer on economic strength. And we can also go forward then, because here we can contribute so much to a stronger Europe in these times of geopolitical and geoeconomic challenges. Jana, I know you had the chance to read the speech in advance. What has been the most noticeable thing here? Now the federal government has been in office for 1 year. So much is discussed about the outcome of the first year, and so much needs to be done. What is the key aspect in this speech? Well, the key aspect in the speech has been the realization that we in Europe, in the foreign and security policy, we cannot march forward as 27 countries with the same rhythm, but we need a phase. I think it was apt and correct that these options of qualified majority decisions make it possible. Yes, he mentioned this and he highlighted this once again. At the same time, it's also the triumph of hope over experience, because these ideas have been with us for quite some time. The Juncker Commission submitted proposals on how to strengthen the majority decision by using this passerelle clause. Not much has happened, so the political will is severely underdeveloped. In this speech, well, I missed one thing. I think the analysis is right. Not everybody together, not all in the same step, but and the observations over the last months have demonstrated this. Great Britain is also part and parcel of these necessary steps, and also a country like Norway, especially when it comes to the initiatives undertaken for the Strait of Hormuz, support lent to Ukraine, a glance also at security perspectives. France and Great Britain have been the triggering powers to bring about these new initiatives. I would like to see a stronger Germany, because Europe is more than just the EU. We need to find interlinks with countries like Great Britain and also Norway. If it's not possible in the EU framework, and if countries want to cooperate closer with each other, we need to allow for a framework, a mobile and flexible option to cooperate closer, even outside the framework EU, but in a way that does not undermine the cohesion of the member states within EU. How can one shape multilateral relationships outside of the EU without damaging the EU? In the past, this has happened. In the E3 negotiations with Iran, the EU benefited from it. So it is doable. Now, Mr. Thijs, you are a member in the EU committee, in the Defense Committee. in the Bundestag. Well, in abstract term, it is clear, well, we have a shared objective, but oops, we see so many conflicting interests on the way to this objective. What's your take on this? Do you see that we are effectively working more intensely and that we can really achieve this inside the EU? You are certainly right in your initial assumption. Standing around a green table, how can we organize today in view of the challenges that we are faced with in terms of risks and military threats? How should it be organized? Well, of course, we would reach totally different outcomes, different from what we are having today. Defense is for many nation states such an integral part and parcel of their sovereignty that they do not want to allow in neither the Commission nor any other member states. So my impression is that this principle of sovereignty has been strengthened more. Therefore, I found it noticeable and a positive thing that a German foreign minister had the floor. Despite the changing conditions, he made a clear commitment to the European process of integration. You are right in your realistic assessment, yes, with your objection. But will it work at the end of the day? But we haven't lost the bearing, the compass. So this is a very important starting point for considerations. Second, the dramatic changes has been taken in such a way that we do not even perceive the background against which this is happening, not least in the transatlantic relationship. Many of the Christian Democrats, well, we are dyed in the wool transatlantics. We have sucked it in with our mother's milk. With a view at our American partners, they will ask themselves, are these certainties still valid? Can we rely on them? But I would underline in it what Wadephul said, it's a conflict of objectives. As long as it is possible to keep the US invested in Europe and, on the other hand, to become adult and autonomous as Europeans, this is a real conflict of objectives. You cannot settle it smoothly, both rhetorically and factually. You need to take a decision which will not go on without certain conflicts and also scratches and pain. The foreign minister, well, that we saw said, yes, we need to cling to it. We see that the certainty is no longer there, but this is the huge challenge with which German and European defense policy is faced. But I found it rather refreshing. In view of dwindling certainties, a German foreign minister said, I believe in this Schuman project because it has demonstrated its validity over the years, and the challenges 75 years ago were certainly not smaller than the ones we have today.
What is remarkable is this strong focus on the European Union and less on the role of Germany. But now the question is, what would be Germany's role to help Europe to weather the storm? Jana, you focused a lot on German leadership. How do you assess the current situation? Is this something that the EU wishes for, that German leadership? And we mentioned the fact that we should find out who's in charge, who's got the hat on, so to speak. Is it the commissioner or the foreign representative? Well, in other European countries, there are high hopes for Germany. There's a lot of expectation towards Germany, and this has been that way for many years. But with greater uncertainties within the transatlantic relationship, this has again been exacerbated. There is some positive expectation and positive echo as a reaction to the Zeitenwende, the watershed moment announced by the former Chancellor on the part of Great Britain and France, amongst others. I mean, these partners are stable in geopolitical terms, but in terms of fiscal policy, they are also still somewhat powerful, and this is why they have high expectations towards Germany. I experienced this in particularly in the Nordics and in the Baltic states, in particularly in particular in Lithuania, the reaction to the stationing of German Bundeswehr soldiers in the Baltics are so positive. They are being celebrated for being there. And this is a nice experience for Germany to make. At the same time, over the past couple of months, I've realized that coming from France and from Poland in particular, there is some irritation, distrust that again is on the rise. And for me, this was not an easy thing to accept at first, because even if there's always talk about neighbors being afraid of a stronger Germany, then I always suspected that Germans wanted to hide behind themselves. But there are now greater sensitivities that are being uttered, that are being expressed clearly, and we have to deal with it. And when it comes to assuming a leadership role in Europe for Germany, it is not just about having the biggest defense budget, building up the strongest army and creating the necessary prerequisites to do so, but also to bring in the interests of our partners, to make compromises, to be cooperative, to act in a spirit of trust, because Germany has this special historic role, its own identity, and we've carried this along as a mission statement that this is our role precisely. So it's a good thing to have a military strategy now that is entitled Responsibility for Europe. It was just announced recently, but it'd be better if we made it even clearer that we assume responsibility together with European partners. And where do we want to cooperate precisely with our European partners, so that military strength is interwoven with what other European partners do. And sometimes France and Poland need greater reassurance in that matter. Let's get back to Germany. Ms. Gunner, some time ago you made a call for a watershed moment at Zeitenwende in economic terms, and you exerted pressure because the foreign minister mentioned that every day so many jobs are being lost, and this is dramatic. And when thinking of the fact that the EU is only strong as long as its member states are strong, then we first have to look at what's going on in our own backyards. What is your take on the Zeitenwende, on the economic watershed moment? Thank you so much. Let me pick up on what Jana Puljarin just said, because we share this opinion. As a matter of fact, many are looking at what Germany is doing, and of course many are aware of the fact that Germany is having a hard time deciding how much it wants to contribute. And I'm telling you this because this is important for our German industry within Europe. When getting in touch with colleagues from other European countries, this is a topic time and again, and I mentioned it before. The fact that they keep telling us, well, friends, we need you to take on a leadership role once again, to act as a motor. This goes to show that there is a great deal of expectation here. And they actually really ask us to make our own homework. They are imploring us to do our own homework, and in particular when it comes to fields that are important for our own competitiveness, we have to make a greater commitment. So I'd rather differentiate this here. The government that is in a coalition does something positive, i.e. European coordination sets in at an earlier stage. And we're investing in that, and this is very helpful. But at the same time, there are so many essential fields in which we are hardly able to take a stand in due time. At the moment, we are having a discussion, and this morning there was a vote or a word of power with the AI Act, and things are now being pushed forward, and this is important for our economy, but let's wait and see in the trilogue this evening whether this will hold true. But many people waited for Germany to position itself, and so many others haven't come forward either. And it means that the European Council is hardly able to act, or can only act very late in the process, which is actually a pity. But when looking at the economic turnaround in Germany myself, well, I am always somewhat caught between encouraging things, supporting things, pushing them forward, and you realize that pushing things forward is something we have to do a lot at the moment. We support it a lot by submitting proposals, and this would be something that could make an impact. And cheering on from the sidelines wouldn't really be helpful, I believe. I think people have not yet become aware of the full sense of urgency of things. Why am I telling you this? I mean, there is always an interest for policymakers to illustrate the positive examples, and this is the right thing to do, to my mind. But if this creates the impression that everything else would just boil down to criticizing things, associations, scolding others, and for not having made their homework, I mean, this is just an emotional reaction, which is not always a good thing, but realities show us that every day we get the news of jobs being lost, and this goes to show that we are truly in a dire situation. And I'm fully convinced that if we are not adopting reforms quite consistently in fields such as cutting down on red tape, modernizing the state always has to start by reforming itself, and also that has to be a reflection on energy costs and ancillary wage costs. And if this is not done, if this is not reformed, we can no longer be competitive. We need to be competitive to be a motor for others as well, and to be able to support a strong Europe. But of course, I'm telling you deliberately that the tariffs imposed on us are painful, and the war in Iran is even exacerbating things. But I mean, if we want to restore our own strength, and if we were able to do so, we would fare way better when faced with all the different geopolitical challenges.
And to restore and to build one's own strength. You said impelling, supporting, and also cheering up. What else? Well, first, that's not a bad thing for a start, but no kidding. Well, the question is, how else can we do this? Well, ultimately, I would say what the Minister of Foreign Affairs has achieved in cooperation with other countries. I would say at times there is a totally different shape of society, economy, and politics is needed. Yes, we have quite often the discussions about the foundational order of politics and of the societal institutions. Well, yes, what does it mean? Ordnungspolitik, the basic fundamental order. What does it mean? At times of transformation in which we are now living under the perspective of the climate change, where are things so we need the topic that we have just had. We always go into the nitty-gritty, and we do not have a strategy any longer, or we have a high-flying strategy. This will be quite a challenge in implementation, and implementation is missing. What we are suffering from is when do we go into the fundamental questions and how do we translate into concrete terms, not going back from the nitty-gritty details back to the fundamentals, because there are so many challenges. What we can offer are partnerships, but this means a frank talk, and I think it is very helpful. And I take by my side the foreign minister, economic trade policy as part of the foreign politics, and I think this is something which is supported by us. But we need an exchange. What is the one thing where you need our support? By the same token, resilience, security, and sovereignty. It must be seen there will always be interventions. And I think it's a good thing to talk upfront about possible interventions and to tell what is the right way.
Mr. Theis, the profound transformations that need to take place because the world is changing way too much, and the foreign minister said that we would have to become faster at last. How do you perceive the situation in your constituency and in German parliament? This sense of urgency, is it still around in your constituency, or have people become sobered and when it comes to politics? I think we shouldn't underestimate people's ability to understand things. People do know that there is a close interconnection between economic competitiveness on the one hand, economic power, and defense readiness and security on the other hand. And this is why the gravity of the debate is something that many people are aware of. In Germany, we created exemptions. We said that we would spend as much as needed for defense, regardless of whether we can afford it, and we would finance this by debt. But this would not be sustainable because we will only defend ourselves when we are strong enough in economic terms. If this doesn't work out, everything else won't work either. This is what I'm aware of, and sometimes in my constituencies people know more about it than members of the German Bundestag. And let me pick up on what Ms. Puljarin just said with regard to our European partners, because Germans are very thorough in everything. We were the most thorough pacifists over decades. Top-notch diplomacy, and now we are the ones that want to build up the biggest conventional army of Europe, and this is a fact. We want to achieve it in order to make the biggest possible contribution for defense against potential enemies. But we have to ask ourselves, how is this understood in Warsaw, in Paris? And I just attended a session of the Defense Committee at the Assemblée Nationale in France, where the colleagues discussed how relationships were going on between us. And it's not just right-wing and left-wing extremists asking us, where are you headed? Where is Germany headed? And because of the historical experience made in France and in Poland, this impression is maybe somewhat stronger. But to put it in other words, I don't want to have German Europe. We want to have a European Europe, and Germany is willing to make its contribution and to contribute its fair share. How are we speaking our minds? And there is a wonderful formula coined by Helmut Kohl. Germans are a friend of the big ones and the advocates of the small ones. We don't claim to be the leaders, but we are ready to assume responsibility. I believe that moderation in German foreign policy has to be cast in words, and I heard that in the speech pronounced by the foreign minister just before. And sometimes we are deliberately misunderstood or actually misunderstood. And it keeps me thinking, in particular when talking about armament, and we're getting to that point, that we are better off doing everything on our own and fast because we urgently need things. But this should not happen that way, but we should get organized in a better way. Yes, of course. And we just thought about where we may contradict one another. And I found a potential point of contradiction because you said we should not pretend to be leaders. But I believe we cannot afford to not formulate this claim to be leaders. Well, we should not be the only leaders. Okay, so this is more of a match because others expect Germany to take the lead, and we lead automatically because we are so big. We play a crucial role. We have a big national economy, and this is why our decisions are always important. People are hiding behind Germany, following in our footsteps, are waiting for us to act. And I've noticed this in debates in our country that some citizens have a hard time playing along and thinking of Germany as acting as a strong leader. But let's be aware of the fact that this is something that Europe actually needs. And here we do agree we should formulate this claim for leadership, but we should do so in cooperative terms, because no country in Europe in defense could replace the Americans. I mean, I don't want them to be out, but if they are no longer willing to assume that responsibility for Europe, then the question is who would jump in, who would take the lead and take over from them. And this can only be a coalition including Germany as a central partner. Well, I take the risk to further reduce this contradiction, mentioning one aspect that is dear to my heart in what both of us just outlined. Germany doesn't want to be a sole leader and doesn't want to claim to be a sole leader. Why is that? It's because we cannot impose this claim. Take defense as an example. We are not even able to do it. Even if we wanted this to happen, we can't become a European hegemonial power, neither in terms of our economy, of defense, or of the mindset that is needed to do so. So we're not able to do it. So it's in our own interest, as a friend of the big ones and a lawyer for the small ones, to pull everyone along, because we can no longer afford others to relax and hide behind us and point their fingers to the Germans to sort things out. I mean, we are too big to back down, but we're too small to do it on our own. And this is a lesson learned from history, and it's just intelligent enough to be on the lookout for partners in Europe. Allow me, please, to bring in a new angle. I won't contradict you in any point, but let me put precisely what is striking and what challenges us. In France, economic policy is organized entirely differently from what we have in Germany. And of course, we coordinate with our partners at a European level to position ourselves, and I'm the one who finds it important to find a compromise all along. But at the same time, I can't take over French economic policy and translate it to make Germany more competitive and present this as a solution to Germany. But when looking at the figures in France, they are not that positive either. Maybe they're marching ahead, and I may tend to say that industrial policy is not the right approach to take, but we should be open to the markets. But why am I telling you this? This goes to show that we are not claiming to be the sole leader, but when taking the lead together with others, it requires a lot. It costs a lot of time. It is so much of an effort. It requires mutual understanding. You have to start over time and again. And I thought, and I'm going to bring in Poland as well, because over the past couple of years, there's been splendid development in Poland, and so many German companies, by the way, are active in Poland because they are convinced that the attitude towards business is different. People are ready to work towards their own ascension. And how are we able in this situation and to balance out the specificities of these three countries, of the Weimar Triangle, and it be worthwhile in all walks of life to think about what we need. And I believe I have an idea of what this means, what needs to be invested to get there. In Europe, it would be helpful for our economy and our policy making if we were able to work together, because the different approaches that are available in Europe are well reflected here. Okay, focusing on Europe a bit more, and then later on I'm going to open up the discussion for the audience. The foreign minister mentioned a intensified cooperation. He mentioned PESCO, SAFE and REARM. But now the first Space and Defense Commissioner seems to be quite lonely sometimes. What is this due to, Jana? The question is, what do I expect from the European Union? What is the role it can play, in particular in security and defense policy, which is the field of Mr. Kubilius? And I would make a call on us to think big in terms of our ambitions, whilst at the same time being aware of the fact that the EU can't be turned into something that it is not poised to do, and for which an amendment to the treaty would be needed. So when thinking of Europe's architecture in terms of security and defense policy, just like for many others, I think NATO is the organization that comes to my mind first. And here the huge task is up to the Europeans, and this is also communicated clearly by the Americans, that there is to be a European-led NATO or a more European NATO, and how this can be implemented. And this is the priority task when looking into the future architecture of NATO. Even if Americans no longer play the role they used to play, the question to my mind is, how can we have NATO evolve so that it can be robust enough to be functional? And when thinking about it, well, I'm not the one telling you we need a further development of the European Defence Union to turn it into a European army, or the plans you may hear of. Spain mentioned the objective being a European army, mind you, and I found it interesting because I hadn't heard about it for a long time. But the question is, how can Europe make and create added value? It is in industrial policy, in financing, in regulation, and in greater legitimacy. And providing greater legitimacy is important for me, because the question may arise in case of an Article 5 scenario, but the biggest NATO member state is no longer on board. How could we then respond to an Article 5 case? 42.7 could be interpreted in such a way that it makes sense, and mini-lateralisms may add to the picture. European security and defense should be enshrined in the institutions, but where this is not possible, there are mini-lateralisms, and we can think on them. For instance, the GEF pushed forward by the British as a political forum, or the Nordic-Baltic 8. All these fora exist, and how can we make sure that this patchwork really becomes one?
Mr. Theis, let's stay with this metaphor of the defense union. The EU did take important steps a long time ago. It regulates, it provides funding, it also establishes cooperation mechanisms. Where are we on this way, and what is still missing? And what are the terms of the discussion? Well, first of all, what you suggest here, yes, we do have success. The fact that SAFE is running so smoothly and so successfully as we would have never thought is testament to this. Second, we have got so many things, but one thing is not abundantly dear: time. Time, especially not for negotiating new agreements. We should work on the basis of the given competences, because we would lose the most precious asset, i.e. The time to get ready to defend oneself. The EU must do the one thing that it can do best. Internal market, well, I'm under tight control by you. The internal market is the big success story of European Union, but it must be working also in the defense industry. The fact that we have such a highly fragmented procurement is not only a financial problem. We are the second biggest spender on military, but we have by far lower military capacities that we would get elsewhere for this money. So we must become more efficient. The internal market in defense is 3S: scaling, standardization, simplification. These are things that the European Union can do. What has succeeded for pharmacies and for pharmaceuticals as well should not also be working for defense. despite all the national egoisms. The same is true for military mobility. We are the turntable. We, Germany, well, we must get forward, but it's blocked by administrative hurdles. Well, yes, we should say, we will stick to our competences, but we will take more pragmatic approaches. Kubelius is doing the right thing, in my view. Well, it does not hurt to say, yes, we've got a vision, but it must be a long-term vision. What we can do now matters. Beyond that, there is one big question looming over the European Union, and we should talk about this. The EU is qualified to say something per se, where currently and existentially it's about security. How can we integrate Ukraine into the European security architecture, fully knowing that in all likelihood the accession to NATO is blocked, and also realizing that the EU in the shape as we know it, Ukraine cannot be taken in within a year or as quickly as so many would love to see, cannot be integrated so quickly. But we do need Ukraine by our side for the defense of Europe. If we go about this in a wise manner, both bilaterally and on a European level, well, this will be a crucial question. We must find an answer. We cannot renounce the best and the biggest European army. These are not the Germans, but the Ukrainians. In the defense industry, well, thanks God, there is a close cooperation between Ukraine and Germany and other EU partners. But, well, there is still room for improvement, especially when it comes to designing drones and electronic warfare. But the European arms internal market, in what terms do you in the BDI discuss this? How hopeful are you? Well, here I could say rather flippantly as BDI, if we were speaking only as a BDI, not only in close coordination with our membership associations, we would say it would be a good thing to have a European unified procurement. But you see it just by my if and whens. We need to discuss this with our membership associations. Well, there are some challenges, and there are two schools of thought. There is one school of thought that says, let us standardize and do it together. And then there is other school, well, let's leave everything to everybody, but we will then cooperate in production. Well, at various places, the second line of thought seems to be more successful or more dominant. Whether this will really pay off in reaching our objective for a joint procurement, well, I'm not sure. Well, we have so many different vehicles on wheels, and in this variety of lines of thought is also reflected the question, how much time is left? Well, to a representative of the Minister of Defense would say, in the past, we had so much time and so little money. Now it's the opposite. We have so much money but so little time. Well, the interesting thing about this is the defense industry, by its very nature, has only the government as the client and also the buyer. So the question, how can it be made working efficiently and effectively? Something that is on my mind. How can we hammer out our position as a trade association? We are living through a time where we see that the capacities are changing. We are in intense discussions about questions like, is it rather the same equipment that we have been seeing for a long time, which was of the utmost necessity at the beginning of the Ukraine war, or is it rather the latest developments? And in this case, it would be rather the startups. We have a broad array of different views, and we have to discuss all of them. So the position is, yes, we think it is, in our view, the right thing to do, a European procurement. Nonetheless, you will never be able to Europeanize the entire industry because we come into the fray of national stakeholders and industries. And the most challenging thing is, as soon as you talk to the industry companies, ammunition is one thing. Well, you could say it's about industrialization, but by far the bigger portion of defense technology. When we talk about industrialization, it means automation, changing the processes, scaling up, and to produce the highest possible number of items. With the sole exception of drones, I am not sure whether with heavy armaments and equipment we will ever have such big numbers as to make automation a profitable option. So it's not only about time and money, but we need to bring in also some other issues. On top of all that, we need to stay active, we need to get forward, and let me put it like this. I do believe, well, we are now in the special funds of 100 billion euros, and we have certain exemptions and also rules for exceptions and exemptions. Well, I hear so many different voices whispering around. It's not only about the budget. Now it's over to you. Your chance to take the floor. Mr. Pöttering. Thank you, dear Ms. Krause. I'm 80 years old. Allow me some remarks with 35 years of sitting in the European Parliament. First, the concept of trust does play a huge role, even today in politics. In the contributions both by Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer and also by the foreign minister, we heard the names of Robert Schuman, Alcide de Gasperi, and Konrad-Adenauer. These three men had an almost blind trust in each other. In today's politicians' generation, I can only recommend to create trust between the active politicians. Helmut Kohl is a shining example. And when Helmut Kohl presented his 10-point program for the unification of Germany, the American President George Bush was asked, Mr. President, were you informed? And I checked it out. Yes, it is right. Bush said, no, but I trust Helmut. Second remark, this regards the big and the small ones. Helmut Kohl was a master in understanding the small countries. If you allow, in my former position as the head of the parliamentary group, you have the huge delegations, the Germans, in the Britons, the French, and the Italians. I, as the president, followed always the principle you must never have the big delegations against you, but the small delegations must be in favor of you, so that they know he will represent our interests. My third point, well, Johann Wadephul, well, we admire him also for his capability to present NATO as such a strong alliance, but we need to take notice that the U.S. has a president that is not only uncalculable, but who plays with and destroys the dignity of his own country. Which brings me to Europeans and European unity. The American president, I'm not interested in the international law. I will follow my own moral principles. Let's hope he has got any of them. It's our task to represent our European values, the dignity of human beings, freedom, democracy, rule, and peace. And now this is the huge challenge posed on the way of the active politicians today, leading the foundations that we can defend our values, if possible with the Americans. But we must do everything should the worst case happen that they cannot go with us, that we can do it on our own values and creating the possibilities or the capacities to defend our own values. Thank you very much. And please use the microphone. Please present yourself. Guten Tag. My name is Małgorzata Gehmann, and I'm the head of the Berlin of the Polish Institute for International Affairs. Before asking my question, a quick comment. Polish side, our Mr. Sikorski put it like this: we are rather afraid of German inactivity than of German activity. Ms. Günner, you mentioned the role of time. We are briefly upfront to parliamentary elections in Poland, in France, in Germany, the Landtags elections. We see one question on this screen. We have tried to find an answer, but do we have a plan B? Should ever in the future the distribution of forces be different? Do we have anything in store? Well, we can collect further questions because I believe there are so many questions. It is a very, very good question, but I think there are so many other questions. Let's collect 3 questions. So before I go back to the panel, please move forward and please use one of the microphones. Servus, Johannes Boss of Model NATO Germany e.V. It's hard. One of my previous speaker said, mentioned the topic of values. It's about the German values, European values, and I was missing this up to this point in the panel discussion. The minister had mentioned it. At the end of the day, it's about defending European values. Ukraine defends European values. The question is, to what extent to have a resilient and independent Europe? The values that we want to embody together with Europe as Germany, or as a Western system of alliances, how do we want it? How do we want to make it credible to our partners in the global South? Because in my view, in my perception, let's say, for 20 years, much trust has been lost on the way. Thank you. Thank you. A third question, a comment. Mr. von Kleden. Thank you very much. I would like to make 2 comments and would ask for your take on this. When it comes to the defense capacities of Europe, I'm not so pessimistic as you might hear it quite often in the public. There are 2 impressive developments. First, we have 2 fantastic armies in the army, the Swedes and the Finns as new members of NATO. And second thing, the military transformation is pushing ahead in at such a pace that the former advantage of Russia, the high quantity of material, is no longer so disadvantageous for us, but does no longer play out with such leverage. So we can make use of our new scale, and we can also benefit from it. My second point is, and I think this is massively underrated, is the economic decay of Europe, especially comparing to the 2 other big economic areas, the United States and China. Well, I have retrieved the figures of the real GDP for US, Germany and China. So since 2008 or 2019, the change is dramatic. 2008, 230%, Eurozone 18, Germany 15, China 205% growth. Any year, the base is growing. Europe is the weakest in these 3 economic areas. The percentage points are misleading as such because they pretend a strength in performance that does simply not exist. In Brussels, they do not understand this. The Green Deal that was announced as the landing on the moon has ended up as Brussels. We have a problem. In the big technological trends, energy for AI, applied materials, and humanoid robotics, the competition is played out between China and the US. Europe does not play a role in this. Not any role. The first thing to do would be to ask, am I ready to acknowledge this? And which steps am I ready to take? What else must happen before the people in Brussels are ready to at least acknowledge this problem? So these are hard issues, but these are only questions about what is behind it is the dramatic scenery. Jana, do you want to start?
Das hat den Vorteil, dass ich mir raus.
Well, the good thing about it is that I can pick what I would like to answer to. Let's stick to my topic, which is defense capability displayed by Europe. Can we be optimistic or pessimistic? I agree with you. Sweden and Finland are a big gain for NATO. And I would always say that we do have the potential as Europeans when it comes to conventional defense to be able to defend ourselves autonomously. So I only partially agree with Mark Rutte when he says we cannot defend ourselves without the Americans. As per today, he may be right, but for the future, I'm positive, I'm optimistic that we can be much more autonomous and independent. But still, as things are today, when looking at the United States and our dependence, we realize what this is about for deep strike. That when the US won't station those arms, that we cannot replace them. Well, some of you may have been optimistic, but let's wait and see. But when it comes to air defense, logistics, ISR and all the nuclear components, well, there's a lot room for improvement. But I share your optimism that we will have to do it when we give all that it takes. But what about power distribution in Europe? What can we do and what do we do when in many European states and in Great Britain governments assume power that think that European integration is part of the problem, not part of the solution, and that take a more nationalist stance? And here we need to really give stronger thought to how we can live in such a scenario where Jordan Bardella may become the French president. How can we keep up our cooperation with France, and how can we make sure that this is not the end of everything? We should give stronger thought to such a scenario, and we should think of the necessary interlocutors and how can we find common ground, such as we did with Giorgia Meloni in Italy. I don't want to compare the two players, but I think this is the biggest challenge that we need to address. Because we see movements popping up all over Europe that don't correspond to what we had hoped for a couple of years ago, and we need to respond to that and react. But I think that the overriding interest, and this is what Giorgia Meloni realized straight away, the overriding interest lies in still working together as Europeans, so that no European country would be more successful being purely nationalist in such a world, such as Kathleen described it. Same goes for Viktor Orban. He never left the European Union for a well-justified reason. So we need to think about how can we strengthen European cooperation and make it more attractive for these countries, or in other words, make it harder for countries not to follow suit, not to join in, not to cooperate, so that this would go along with a high cost. But this is the decisive question. Thank you, Jana. So a values-led foreign policy, we felt that there were some hints to that in the speech given by Mr. Wadephul. How can we now become active? Well, can I comment on the first question, because I'm very much intrigued by it? I mean, when thinking of the plan B, we first need to state that it was clever to take integration steps that, as you rightly mentioned, would never be questioned, even by right-wing nationalists. I mean, Rassemblement National is not in favor of leaving the EU. I'm not advertising for them. They're still dangerous. But I mean, we can be proud on those integration steps that we don't want to fall behind anymore because the population wants to have them. Rassemblement and Wadephul are at least, meanwhile, acting more amicably towards the European Union because they know that the French don't want to dispense with the European Union or the euro. So this is the first point and can be lesson learned for the future. Take integration steps that can no longer be reversed or the cost will be too high. Second point, the same old saying that has been quoted all along by Wolfgang Schäuble, the French Minister of Finance, regardless of the party he belongs to, is my friend. But it's going to be hard to keep this principle alive if that person no longer wants to be our friend. Nevertheless, in such a scenario, it would be all about finding flexible cooperation formats within Europe that would allow those who want to do it to take the lead. So we should not be hindered or impeded by them. It's difficult for Hungary, it's be even more difficult for France, but the good news is that elections follow elections. The game is not over. We've seen more of this kind in the past. And third point, we should not conjure up this spectre. According to the polls, Edouard Philippe would be in the second round of elections in France, and he'd be somebody who'd be largely accepted from amongst the wide parts of the population. The French have always decided against giving the bomb to an extremist and to vote in an extremist majority to the National Assembly, so this should not be a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I know the argument that is also disseminate here in Berlin, whether we can still work together with the French in such a situation. But we should not turn this into a self-fulfilling prophecy and show more determination. So values, this is another point. Competitiveness can be commented on by Tanja Gönner. The problem with regard to European values is as follows. Those values are under pressure, i.e. democracy, the rule of law, human rights, have a lot of opponents around the world, and I find that it is part of hybrid warfare to attack our values. And I consider this to be part of hybrid warfare to erode defense readiness, the willingness to defend ourselves, and the question as to whether we've got something worthwhile defending. This is what we perceive when we get the impression that our deficits are underlined more than our strengths. And here we need to be critical of ourselves and look at our own problems, do some navel gazing. Are we self-critical enough? At the CDU's rally, there were so many people insisting on the necessity to cut down on red tape, which is, of course, right. But, I mean, we focus too much on such issues without focusing on Europe. And it is an easy temptation to always focus on the deficits. 20 years ago, many people said we need a new narrative for the European Union. In the past, it used to be peace, and peace has now become natural, is now a given. But the good news is this narrative is again topical. For Europe, this has been the topmost priority, and Europe has always been a peace project, and this is more topical today than ever before. I'd like to pick up on three aspects, and I'm, of course, gladly answering to the question about the self-fulfilling prophecy. Let me pinpoint it. we are somewhat eroded by our fears, and we should stop giving in to our fears, because fears make us smaller. We need to display self-confidence, knowing what our tasks are, and we need to act self-confidently. And I mean, being afraid of death and therefore committing suicide has never been a good idea, so I wouldn't advise you to do so. I'm not talking down things, and I'm not minimizing things here and embellishing things. I mean, in business, we're talking about current events as well. We're very much concerned by it as well, and so I am very grateful to Mr. Theis and his remarks. Now, you asked about values. We uphold all these values, and as an association, we commit ourselves to the values mentioned by Ansgar Pöttering. But let me extend that point. In the past couple of years, and this takes me to competitiveness, we've sold some values to partners that gave rise to questions for them. And we ran the risk of losing sight of the basic values such as freedom, peace, democracy, the rule of law, and we somewhat neglected them. And I'm telling you this because I worked in development cooperation. When I traveled to partner countries in Africa, they told me, well, we would gladly work together with you in Europe, but then they told us, then you keep telling us everything has to be sustainable, everything has to be climate friendly. And then there was another topic that was claimed, which is important to me as a woman in particular, but this was what they felt, what things were all about when working together with us. And African countries preferred to work with China because they wanted to create competition. They didn't believe that China was the better partner because they did know that China would start to exploit them. And the way in which German and European cooperation was fleshed out was completely different from what China offered, but they were interested in making us engage in a competition, something which we did not understand, which we did not accept, because possibly in our narratives we kept broaching our values that would not fit with what our partners wanted from us. I mean, this is a tricky wording, and I fully subscribe to the values that we embody and that are now under pressure. I'm very grateful for your remark. We need to defend what is now under pressure because this is what characterizes us and what makes us strong as Europeans and what can help us. I'm telling you because of the Due Diligence Act in supply chains. I mean, have you talked to African partners? They thought that that was a protectionist measure and not a support given to them. They thought that this was interference with their internal affairs and not an act of supporting them and what was important. I'm just putting this in front of you because this is also something that counts when you travel to the European South. They always accuse us of a lack of credibility. They need to trust us. And here I fully agree with you, Mr. Pöttering. Trust is of the essence. And this takes me to competitiveness. And trust is a topmost priority for business as well. Robert Bosch once said, you can lose money, but you may never lose trust. So there are so many interlinkages between policy making and business. Eki, thank you very much for providing the figures. 42, 18 and 15, and Germany fared even worse than the EU, by the way. So I was very grateful to you for having delivered the figures, because this demonstrates that we need to do our homework, and only if we do so can we move up to the next level. And here I'm grateful to your remarks, for your remarks as well. When speaking with German policymakers, I often tell them we can gladly talk about Europe, but first we have to do our homework. Because whenever we turn away from our own problems and point our fingers to others, it's problematic. We should do our own homework. And in economic policies, we will not fail of mentioning that we have to do our homework, because then we can go along with our partners, and we will do so as German industry representatives. Because let me stick to it, once we are competitive, once we are able to build a solid common market, for 20 years we neglected it. The European Commission did so as well. So once we bank on the European Common Market, once again, this may unfold its own power and strength. And once we have that strength again, we can more easily defend our values, because it will turn out that freedom, democracy, peace, and the rule of law are the values that make us stronger in economic and political terms and make us and can turn us into an economic giant that we want to be. And only then will we be able to stand strong in this discussion. I think this is crucial, and I share your view. People understand this. German citizens understand that there are these interlinkages, but are we courageous enough to now be rolling up our sleeves? And I know that it takes a great deal of political effort to do it. I'm fully aware of it. But I mean, if you're giving in to your fear, you're going to be smaller than you are and you won't reach any results. So I don't feel like indulging in fears, even if sometimes I need motivation myself. But I'm not afraid, and I don't want to be smaller than I am. And we've got so many solutions that are proposed. Mr. Draghi will receive the Karls Prize next week, so we've got it in our own hands, and we can simply do it, and we should do it. Okay, there couldn't be a better closing remark than yours. We can weather the storm, we can act if we don't indulge in fears, but if we do our homework together. And we're not alone, we are not on our own. We've got great partners within Europe. And we've got strong industries, we still have them, and we've got innovative and committed people we should never forget about. Thank you very much to the outstanding panelists, to our audience, but also in particular to the team of the Adenauer Conference. And now let me briefly read out a couple of names. It's quite a huge team because it requires a great deal of effort. Liefer Stupak, Jan Reimann Groß, Marcel Schmidt and Jochen Blind, Julia Berger, Wittine Muschig and Melanie Wirth, Evelyn Geiser. Huge round of applause for you, and Matthias Barner, without whom things wouldn't have worked out. And thank you to the interpreters, Veronika Gruber and Johannes Hampel. And of course, thanks as well to the technicians, to Heiko Ried. Thank you very much to all of you. And we'll now have the opportunity to continue our talks at the reception, so please do stick around, and thank you very much for joining us, for having joined us here live or in our stream.